Einen schönen guten Abend, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Bei der Helligkeit tut man sich noch so ein bisschen schwer, in den Abend einzuleuchten, aber wir freuen uns ja, dass wir jetzt ein bisschen die längeren Tage haben. Herzlich willkommen hier im Körber-Forum zu unserer heutigen Veranstaltung. Auf Deutsch der Titel Geteilte Vergangenheit, und dieser Titel ist bewusst zweideutig gewählt: eine gemeinsam geteilte Vergangenheit oder eine Vergangenheit, die spaltet. Darüber wollen wir heute Abend reden. Heute Abend unser Thema ist die Geschichte von Russland und der Ukraine, und wir wollen natürlich auch über die Frage sprechen, wohin gehört die Krim. Mein Name ist Sven Tetzlaff, ich bin hier im Hause für den Bereich Bildung verantwortlich, und wir setzen heute Abend mit dieser Veranstaltung unsere Reihe History at Debate fort, die wir vor mittlerweile 2 Jahren initiiert haben, gemeinsam mit der Geteilte Stiftung, in deren Namen ich Sie ebenfalls begrüßen darf. Das Gespräch, das werden Sie gesehen haben heute Abend, ist auf Englisch. Ich hoffe, Sie haben sich ausgerüstet, falls Sie eine Übersetzung wünschen, und ich werde daher jetzt ins Englische überwechseln. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Körber Forum, to the 9th edition of History at Debate. I'm pleased to see that so many of you have come to listen and to take part in a debate which will not only touch on historical matters and things of the past, but that holds immediate relevance to ongoing political developments in 2 countries that are our neighbors in Europe, Russia and the Ukraine. To the Körber Foundation, the proximity of these 2 countries is not only a fact of geography, but a point of departure for our activities in the upcoming 2 years. Starting this April, the Foundation has realigned its activities and bundled them in 3 fields. One of them is international dialogue. In this field, we are putting a focus on the relations between Russia and Europe. And to be complete, the other 2 fields are demographic change and innovation in society. For 2 years now, Russia and the Ukraine have been in open conflict. We all have fresh memories of the pro-European Maidan protests and of the referendum and the subsequent incorporation of the Crimea into the Russian Föderation. And it seems that those 2 incidents are merely emblematic of a complex relationship of both countries to one another and their respective histories. The confrontation between Ukraine and Russia is one that by now has turned 2 peoples against each other who long time shared one country. All the more, it is important that we understand what underlies this conflict on Europe's doorstep. What role does the past play in the present, and in which way does it hinder a way forward and a joint effect to find common ground? In both Russia and the Ukraine, the idea that the ongoing military conflict is spreading into the interpretation of the past has acquired a fully official and legitimate character. The space for dialogue within both Russia and Ukraine is shrinking, as it is for dialogue between scholars of both countries. We are therefore all the more glad that we are able to welcome 2 eminent scholars of Russian and Ukrainian history for today's History at Debate. In alphabetical order, I would like to first welcome Professor Georgiy Kasianov of the Ukrainian National Academies of Sciences in Kiev. Born in Russia, Professor Kasianov studied in Kiev and has taught both there and in Budapest and in Berlin. He's currently head of Department of Contemporary History and Politics at the Institute of the History of Ukraine and has authored numerous books on its history from the 19th to the 21st century. He takes special interest in the history of the Ukrainian intelligentsia, theories of nation and nationalism, as well as politics of memory. Professor Kasianov, we are glad to welcome you. From the European University of St. Petersburg, allow me to welcome Professor Alexey Miller. While having worked in the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow until 2014, he has also served as visiting professor at the Central European University in Budapest, held a Humboldt Fellowship, and has taught courses at many European universities from Kiev to Warsaw, Paris, and Manchester. He has published extensively on the history of Eastern Europe, on the comparative history of empires, and on memory politics. Professor Miller, thank you for joining us tonight. Today's debate will be moderated by Katja Gloger. She has worked as a correspondent for the German weekly magazine Stern in both Moscow and Washington, and brings expertise with regard to both Russia and the Ukraine to the debate. In 2015, she published a book titled Putin's World, Russia, the Ukraine, and the West, and incidentally wrote her master's thesis on the contemporary reception of the Crimean War in Tsarist Russia. Welcome, Katja Gloger. And as I already mentioned, history a debate is a discussion format. So we endeavored to open that debate to wider public. We are glad that such a large audience has gathered here today at the Körber Forum, but I wish also to welcome those of you who are following us via the internet and Twitter. My colleague Bernd Vogenbeck will fill you in on the technical details and on how you can become involved in the discussion. Finally, allow me to extend a warm invitation to all of you here in this auditorium to continue our discussion after the debate has ended on stage. We have wine and salty snacks waiting for you. Thank you very much, and now I would like to give the word to Bernd.
Thank you, Sven Tetzlaff. Apart from two historians engaging debate on stage, the idea behind the History of Debate format is to allow for an interested audience not only here at the Körber Forum, but also in the digital realm to actively partake in the ongoing discussion. Those who wish to follow the live stream broadcast on the net can do so either via the website of the Körber Foundation or via the online portal Lisa, managed by the Gerda Henkel Foundation. To the internet audience, there are two possibilities of making your questions and comments heard. First, you can voice your questions, concerns, and commentary either on the Lisa portal directly, and I know that our colleagues there are following and forwarding your input, or second, you can make use of the Twitter hashtag HistoryDebate by typing the hashtag symbol and then HistoryDebate in one word after that into your tweet window on your computer or mobile device. Now be sure, please, to include that hashtag in any question or comment you have so that it actually is received here by us. We will be monitoring Twitter activity and take out time during the debate to include your concerns and questions. Additionally, our audience right here at the Körber Forum will have the opportunity to pose their questions during the Q&A at the end of the debate. With that, I may ask now Georgiy Kasianov, Alexey Miller, and Katja Gloger to come onto the stage. Thank you.
What a nice view, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me all right? Translations are good. So then let's get started. We have some territory to cover and some complicated, complex, and almost adventurous issue to cover tonight. What we want to do, or what I would like to do, is to take you into a little expedition to borderland. This is what Ukraine means, borderland. So I want to take you to the borders of Europe, and it would be interesting to find out where these borders really run. And I'm sure the two distinguished gentlemen here will have their opinion on that. Ukraine, what was it? If we recall the events of the last 2 years, weren't we all caught by surprise that all of a sudden tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people gathered in the center of Kiev and were protesting and demanding, in the very end, the end of a corrupt regime, and they were protesting for Europe. Ukraine is Europe, they were saying, and holding up their little posters. This all caught us by surprise. Wasn't Ukraine second biggest country by territory in Europe? Wasn't this something out there in the east, something somehow belonging to Russia, something more or less Russian, wasn't it, for many of us? Only a few remembered that there had been a real revolution in 2004, and probably few remembered an important NATO summit in 2008 when the United States were pushing for Ukraine to become a member of NATO, which was opposed, by the way, by the German Chancellor, first of all. And there was a famous quote during this meeting, Russia's President Putin talking to US President Bush and telling him, you know, George, in the very end, Ukraine isn't even a real country. And when we even more surprised that then all of a sudden in February 2 years ago, there were little green men appearing on the peninsula of Crimea, that a real annexation, the Russians would argue maybe a homecoming of Crimea took place. And weren't we surprised that all of a sudden in the eastern part of Ukraine, uprising and war broke loose? These events changed the landscape in Europe, in our history, and now we have to ask the question, where does Ukraine belong? How important it is for us here in Germany, here in Western Europe. Will our relationship to Russia be defined by our relationship to Ukraine, or by the events and the political development in Ukraine? At the same time, we are feeling a certain kind of Ukraine fatigue these days. Media do not report very extensively anymore. It's kind of an old story repeated. Corrupt government, political turmoil, and we are starting to think, what the hell are we spending all these billions and billions of dollars and giving political support for a country that apparently will not really change? So why not leave them where they are, kind of belonging to the Russian sphere of influence? So Ukraine is a topic for us. let me take you on this little expedition into the borderlands and start with one question to Professor Miller. The Russian President Putin 2 years ago, I think, said, you know, Russia and Ukraine, we are not even only neighbors. We are way closer than that. We are almost one. We are kind of one people. So is there such a thing like the Ukrainian nation? What is Ukraine for you?
Okay, first of all, let's leave Putin in peace for a while, because what he meant and how accurate he was in terms of treating history is a different story. He doesn't care about accuracy in history, he cares about politics. If you ask me as professional historian, do we have a Ukrainian nation? I would say that Ukrainian nation is in the making. The shape is still to be determined. My argument, which I presented many times during these last 20 years, is that in Ukraine, largely we had, simplifying of course, 3 groups. One group in this 45 million country was simply people with Russian identity. They used to be 12 million, they became 7 million, and 5 million didn't leave, they simply changed the identification. The rest are people who have what I call East Ukrainian and West Ukrainian identity. One of the differences between these two is the attitude towards Russia and Russians. Are they seen as a constitutive other? Are they seen as the main enemy? Or are they seen as the closer relative? How this situation is going to change in these dramatic conditions after 2013-14 remains to be seen. We're at pretty early stage of this history. But coming back to your question, is there something as Ukrainian nation? It is in the making. However, that doesn't mean that some other nations, neighboring, are more, so to say, shaped. If Ukrainian nation is in the making, the Russian nation is in the making also, because these are two very related social organisms.
Professor Kasianov, Ukrainian President Kravchuk, I have to give you a president as well, right? And with a quote, he said, Ukraine does not have its own history. Is that correct?
Well, thank you. Well, he said this in 1993, so it is a bit outdated. Now Ukraine has its history in many occasions and in many shapes. So if we speak about written history, about biography of the nation, which is in the making, and I agree with that, Ukraine is a nation in the making. So yes, we have a long historiographical tradition, started in the end of 19th century. So we have a biography of nation, if we speak about history of nation, as a biography of nation. So if I would be Ukrainian nationalist, I would say that Ukraine have a millennial history. So we exist for no less than 1,000 years. If I would be extreme nationalist, I would say that we exist for 3,000 years. And finally, if I would be super extreme nationalist, I would say that we exist since Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve were first Ukrainians. So However, if we speak about the topic of having a written history, a narrative history, yes, sure. In 1996, American historian Mark von Hagen asked, does Ukraine have a history? And that was exactly about what kind of history Ukraine has. And when Alexey Miller says that Ukraine is nation in the making, and then rightly points out that Russians are also nation in the making, my question would be what kind of nation, what we mean when we say nation. If we speak about political nation, the nation which is based on the principle of citizenship, so I have a passport and I am Ukrainian because I have a Ukrainian passport. If we speak about community of language, history, etc., it also exists, and people are perfectly aware of the fact that they are Ukrainians. And they can, well, to greater or lesser extent, they can comment what does it mean to be Ukrainian. However, if we speak about political aspects, yes, we still have problems with different visions of nation. Either it's a community of language or even blood, or it is a community of citizens. And in this case, when we speak about nation building, we still have this process of forming the nation of the community of citizens. Because now we have, well, some problems became quite obvious when we got into the state of war and state of conflict. And then we also have not just external conflicts, but we also have internal conflicts, which is used by some neighbors.
Georgiy, may I ask you, what kind of language do you speak on the streets in Kiev?
I can speak Russian, Ukrainian, whatever. I can speak English if needed. Well, I can speak German if I could speak German, but generally, if we speak about the common use of language, yes.
Yes.
In Kiev, now we are in Kiev, you can listen, you can hear much more Ukrainian than before. So Ukrainians Ukrainizing themselves in this case. But generally, if the point you made is there is a conflict between languages, there is no conflict between languages. It's instrumentalized by politicians generally. You can go to a so-called extremely nationalistic Lviv in the West and speak Russian, and you will have no problems. Even more, they will deliberately show extreme kind of politeness to those who speak Russian, just to prove that there is no extreme nationalism in Lviv.
Objection, Your Honor.
So is Ukraine a divided country or not?
Pardon?
Is Ukraine a divided country or not? And then comes the objection.
Divided in which terms? In
West, East?
Well, it's imagined division, and of course...
It's an imagined division?
Yes.
So we are all wrong, or most of us are wrong?
It's definitely imagined division, because before the conflict, this was a united country, and to make this conflict, to instrumentalize this conflict, there was a need of intrusion of external force. Of course, there were cultural differences, even I would say civilizational differences, but people lived together in one country, and there was no open conflict between them. The conflict was instrumentalized, and then, unfortunately, some Ukrainian politicians also invested into this.
No divided country, no problems with languages. What's your point on this?
Well,
So,
I don't,
no, Mr. Miller.
Excuse me, I don't say that there is no problems. We have a lot of problems. We can share these problems with you if you want. But generally, I would say that some problems, which always exist everywhere, if you will tell me that there is no problems in Germany with languages and with division of certain parts of population, I would try to trust you. But I think that you do have some problems also with languages also. But the problem is that you might have cultural differences, you might have social differences, whatever. These differences exist everywhere, but they are not instrumentalized into conflict stage. If you have Russian-speaking population concentrated mostly in the East, then you have to admit that they are there and they are in the state of coexistence with Ukrainian-speaking population. But if you will ask them sociologically about their opinion about language, then you will see that the problem of language use is on, if it would be rated, on 29th or 30th position. In the times of crisis, when it is instrumentalized, it can go to the 4th run. And then you will see that people starting speaking, well, we will die for Russian language, or we will die for a Georgian stripe, or we will die for a Great Patriotic War. This is about instrumentalization and actualization of certain issues.
All right, point taken.
Okay, so to begin with, foreign intrusion which somehow changed the whole story. Mr. Strelkov, who arrived in Ukraine with armed people, was at the head of a group of, if I remember correctly, 59 guys. If with a group...
You all remember who Mr. Strelkov was or is? Apparently.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So that was the guy who came from Russia to become the leader of this military uprising against Kiev government after February 2014. So he brought with him 59, if I remember correctly, people. If you come with 59 people to a province of a country and start a war, then probably there was something there before you arrived with these 59 people. Now, does Germany have problems with language? Indeed, of course. What is the difference between German problems with the language and Ukrainian problems with the language? In Germany, you have people who do not speak German or do not speak German as their first language, but these people are seen as the people who came, people who have to be integrated into the existing political and cultural community. So that is something which is close to this understanding of nation-state. I started my discussion of Ukrainian situation of nation building by saying that at least 7 million people there are Russians who did not arrive there just recently as Gastarbeiters. And they didn't come there to replace those who perished in famine of 32-33, as Ukrainian historical textbooks tell us. They lived there, in Donbass particularly, because this region was like Ruhr in Germany or like southern Wales in Britain, with a lot of job openings in the late 19th, early 20th century. And some people arrived in what was at that time, and don't mix it with how Putin used this term, was called New Russia, the lands annexed from the Ottoman Empire, which were very poorly populated because Crimean Tatars were invading this area to take slaves and to sell them in Istanbul up to the end of the 18th century. So if you have 7 million people, at least, with the Russian language, then comes the question, can you really build a nation state of the same structure as Germany? Or maybe you should look for solutions which by political scientists is described by the term state-nation, and which is implemented, for example, in Belgium or in Canada, where two or more culturally and politically mobilized political communities are accommodated in one state. Ukraine had 25 years to discuss this problem, and unfortunately, they never produced a reasonable answer to this question.
Correct, Mr. Kasianov?
Which question I just...
They never produced a reasonable answer to the question how to, so to say, to integrate millions and millions of ethnic Russians and mainly Russian-speaking people living in the east, the Donbass. I think you all know it is a very highly, or was a very highly industrialized region. Since the 19th century, a very modern region in the Tsarist Empire, if I recall correctly. Very progressive, with many workers from many other countries coming. So a region with a lot of self-confidence, if one might say so, and maybe even a specific culture.
Well, generally, Russians are not just located in Donbass. We also have a lot of Russian-speaking population in the south of Ukraine, in the center, etc. So Russians in Ukraine, I myself Russian, ethnic Russian. So Russians in Ukraine are not mobilized as ethnic community, as which has representation somewhere in central government or whatever. They're just ethnic group or cultural group, whatever. So when we speak about Russian population, and we ask, are they Ukrainians in terms of political nation or civic nation? They are Ukrainians in terms of civic or political nation. If we speak about Donbass as a particular region, it is a very interesting story which should be investigated very carefully, because the Donbass as a kind of separate area, the idea of Donbass as like a kind of separate area was cultivated for these 25 years, which Alex just mentioned, that it was cultivated by local elites, by local, I call them local landlords, who wanted to control this area and to exploit it and exploit people there. So yes, these people in Donbass got a kind of local identity, which was cherished and cultivated by local landlords for purely exploitative means, for keeping these people under control, and for which is very important, for fighting for Kiev. Local elites did their best to to make a political work to catch up Kiev, because Kiev is a central power, and Kiev is something which is unifying the country. So after they failed to do this, they did their best also to make a kind of separatism there. Unfortunately, they did it in a way which now has just provoked this kind of troubles. Of course, I do not put responsibility only on these local elites. There is a lot of parties which were involved into this process, which just led to really to the war in the East. However, if I will go back to your question and to the idea of state-nation or nation-state, I think that it's, to a great extent, it's also a theoretical debate. I think that Ukraine, in certain terms, formally, succeeded in establishing the rules for civic nation, but did not establish clear rules for ethnic nations. And this is particularly when we had a period of Mr. Yushchenko as a president. Unfortunately, he did a lot of things which provoked a lot of troubles in nowadays. exploring this and exploiting the concept of ethnic nations and imposing this to the society.
There is a reading, staying in Donbass for one more minute, there is a reading that the conflict and the war that broke loose after the demonstrations on Maidan, that this is a purely Russian thing. Russian thing meaning orchestrated and organized by and in Moscow. Is this reading wrong or right, or is it something in between?
Well, as every let's say every extreme expression, it is, of course, it has some grounds in real life, but of course we cannot reduce all causes just to one reason, just to Moscow. Of course, Putin used this. Sorry, Alex, I cannot leave Putin for.
No, here you don't have to.
Yeah. Okay.
I suggested to leave Putin in peace when we talk about history.
Okay. So,
not about politics.
Okay, so in this case, I'm following your case. Okay. So, of course, it was orchestrated to a great extent. Of course, people were sent, and we have Russian army now there in Donbass. Of course, well, I'm sure, absolutely 100% sure, that if it would not be external influences and external, in fact, intervention from outside, of course, there would not be this kind of conflict there, armed conflict there on Donbass. However, if we speak about responsibility of different parties, of course, we have to speak about central government. We have to speak about a number of really corruptive schemes which allowed these local landlords at Donbass to rule there without any limitations, to turn the population of Donbass, a great share of population, into servants. And this is also about central government and about their responsibility. And I can speak about this endlessly until the end of this day, that there is a lot of parties involved and a lot of parties responsible.
Let me remind you about certain situation which you actually all remember, how Milosevic was going to make order in Kosovo, and what happened later on. So NATO decided, with means which we now question as maybe not really very well designed, I mean bombing Belgrade, to explain Milosevic that he cannot win in Kosovo just using force. Putin was doing the same with Poroshenko. He was trying to explain him several times that he's not going to win with Donbass just using the military force against this population. It took Debaltsevo and it took Ilovaisk. And now Poroshenko, but not all in political milieu of Ukraine, realized that there is no way to military victory in the region. That is my comment.
There is this reading, I have to return to Putin one more time, sorry for that, but that Putin instrumentalizes social problems, economical problems, maybe political problems in the east of Ukraine in order to establish an area of a so-called frozen conflict, meaning instability, no real war, but also no real peace. So all the time something in between, which gives Russia influence and partly control over what happens in Ukraine. How do you look at this, Mr. Kasianov?
Well, we can compare this to other regions, to Transnistria, to South Ossetia, to Abkhazia, and compare to Ukrainian case, and you will see a lot of similarities. The same scenario, the same way of action, and well, in fact, yes, it's true. It's well, I don't think that Putin wants Donbass in Russia.
Why not?
Well, it's quite economically, it's a depressed region. Now it's almost completely ruined to a great extent. Of course, not completely, but to a great extent. It requires a huge, huge amount of everything to recover it. Putin also got Crimea, and now he has a lot of problems with Crimea, I mean in economical terms. So additional burden would be very disruptive for economics and for political power either. So I don't think that Putin wants Donbass to be in Russia, but Putin wants Donbass to be a kind of Transnistria or South Ossetia or Abkhazia in Ukraine. And when I just have very minor reservation about what Alex said, that Poroshenko wanted, or whoever would be in Kiev, wanted to fight people or fight people in Donbass. They don't want to fight people in Donbass. They want, well, I think that in military terms, there's quite different things there and different objectives. I'm not a very great fan of the war in Donbass, but I think that we should be accurate when we speak about the objectives, with whom army fights there. So generally, to sum up, to finalize your point, I would say that you are right, that Putin wants to have this kind of frozen conflict there to control Ukraine through Donbass.
Would you agree?
I would, no, of course.
Of course not.
I would call your attention to the differences between these mentioned conflicts. To begin with, let's take Transnistria.
Transnistria, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
You all know we are talking about the country of Moldova, which might become a member of the European Union, and a part of Moldova right to the bank of a river that is controlled, so to say, by Russia, because you have Russian soldiers in this part, right? And
well,
Transnistria.
Well, let me explain what is Transnistria from my perspective. This region was called the Moldovan Autonomous Republic in the inter-war Soviet Union, and it was mostly populated not by Moldovans, but by Ukrainians and Russians. When Moldova became independent country, Moldovan politicians who were, so to say, Romanian-oriented, desperately wanted the split of Transnistria for a very obvious reason, because only when Transnistria is taken out of the voting process in Moldova, you can have the government which you have in Moldova right now. They had problems with winning with communists even without Transnistria. Whether these guys are doing well in terms of promoting European march of their country or not, it's for you to judge. You read newspapers. But we're coming back to these differences. Georgia, again, very different scenario. What we have in Ukraine is exactly the process which can be described as a struggle of big players, big centers of influence over the control of Ukraine. The whole project of economic union, trade economic union, was designed to engage Ukraine together with Belarus and Kazakhstan. And the whole strategy of Eastern Partnership was designed to prevent this from happening. When it turned out that Putin lost in Kiev in 2013 and 14, he started playing the game of creating a situation in which he would design some new structures and mechanisms of control. Donbass, if it stays in Ukraine, prevents Ukraine from becoming the member of NATO. That is the main reason. Whether Ukraine becomes part of the European Union, etc., ask Dutch, and so on. But the big story here, if we talk about history, this is a fragment of a very big, long story of the strategic rivalry of centers of power about who is strong in Ukraine and who controls Ukraine. This is a long story which started well before the 20th century. Germany joined this history in the 20th century very actively in 2 world wars, among other events. And I think that 2014 marks Russian defeat in its game to control Ukraine as an entity, which does not mean that Putin wants to withdraw from the game altogether. He is playing in different conditions, in different situations, for a different price.
We are always talking about control. Why wouldn't it be possible for a mighty Russia to have Ukraine as its partner amongst its borders?
But the idea of the trade union, this tariff union, economic union, was, if you wish, the idea of having Ukraine as a partner. Ukraine was recognized as an independent state. The question is who controls the processes there. If you say that it is just people in Maidan who are deciding these issues, then we are again working with myths for a very simple reason. There is one very important sociological survey, tragic, which happened on the Maidan on those days, 2 days, when people were shot dead on the Maidan. Close to 100. Look at where these people come from. There were around a dozen or maybe 20 people who lost their lives on the Maidan who come from the eastern part of the country. But they were not the Maidan protesters. They were those police forces who were killed on the Maidan at these days. Maidan was representing the center of the country and the west of the country. So the split is still there. So I'm not going to tire you with all these stories about Vicky Nuland and all this stuff and her talks about who is going to become Minister of Ukraine well before Yanukovych was ousted from the office. We are talking about things to which one guy, you might like him or not, but he has a serious record of being in realist politics. I mean, Henry Kissinger. He said, some people say that there is no realpolitik anymore. It was there for 300 years. Suddenly there is no realpolitik. Tell me why. Kissinger didn't get the answer. I am asking, give me this answer. Why there is no realpolitik anymore?
Before we come to the first questions and reactions through our Twitter account, I wanted to give Mr. Kasianov this question. So is it not to imagine that Ukraine would become a full member of the European Union in the foreseeable future?
May I first very briefly comment what my colleague said about. First of all, I would like to say that it is a bit incorrect, I believe, to extend the so-called statistics. It's not statistics. It's 100 victims, some of them from the east, some of them from the east or west or the center, and this says nothing about the about Maidan and about composition, etc. It's just people killed, and many of them were killed occasionally. So I believe that from the point of view of professional historian, it should not be considered as an argument.
No.
However,
if my professional historian reputation is at stake, I have to answer. That is exactly what I meant. When people, and there is still a question who was shooting whom, when people were shooting these people on the Maidan, they were not asking which region you come from. It was random. And then you can easily count which victim comes from which region. They were all identified. That is what I consider as professional historian to be a very convincing sociological survey of the composition of the Maidan movement.
Okay. As a simple journalist, I would argue that a thorough, full investigation of the events would help in finding the argument. So,
anyway, European Union and Ukrainian membership, I myself, as Ukrainian citizen, doesn't want to be Ukraine to be a member of European Union. So I don't think that we should be so much obsessed with the issue. I'm not very much happy about European Union as an entity, as a historian. So once again, Ukraine, first of all, Ukraine is not ready to join European Union by many parameters, and I don't think that it is a necessity for Ukraine to become a member of EU in, as you mentioned, its foreseeable future. So I'm 55 now, and I think that during my life we will not become a member of European Union. But I think that there is a lot of other ways to become a European country, and if I would say that the first and very important step would be the cancellation of visa regime for Ukrainians, because mostly when people say that we do not want free entry regime for Ukrainians because there was a lot of criminals will come to Europe and will do bad things here. I can assure you that all criminals who wanted to cross the border and to settle up in Europe, they are already there. So, when you keep visa regime, you make a wall between normal people and between loyal people, loyal citizens, and those people who can bring money, knowledge, expertise, whatever. So I think that now decisive step for Ukraine and for European Union, Europe, is to cancel visa regime, and then you will see that everything will be fine with Ukraine. And Ukraine, well, Ukraine is really, it's at least partly, it's European country.
At least partly a European country. Interesting. Our followers on Twitter have something to say, hopefully.
Well, the first followers just commented that there is too much politics on stage and would like to see more debate on historical topics.
Okay.
One question which a namesake of mine, Bernd, has posed is, when does the division start? And he means, when does the division in conceptions of the past start? What are places of memory where there is a division discernible between Russian and Ukrainian views? A second question refers to what Georgiy Kasianov just outlined in a different sense, I believe. The question is, who decides where the Ukraine belongs? And more directly, whether Europe is actually a participant in that process. I don't believe that question is now meant in a political sense, but rather in a sense of whether European people actually take a voice in, well, deciding on whether the Ukraine is actually, well, where it belongs, to the east or the west. Does the Ukrainian people decide on that, or does the Russian people decide on that? A third question which I'd like to bring in is by G. Hurt, who speaks of the influence of history on nation building. And the question, I believe, is whether there is actually a historical narrative that might support a solution beyond the current confrontation. You were talking about a Belgian solution, not necessarily that, but a solution which is which stands apart from mere confrontation. Who would propagate that kind of a historical narrative?
So who would start?
We start with the division question. This one is for...
Okay, so I actually would like to address all three briefly.
Maybe you start with one.
Then let me choose which.
First one.
Okay, so I think that the most interesting question was about belonging to Europe. And somebody mentioned that there is too much politics on the stage. But it's part of history. History is being done. History is being made. I told you that it is the end of certain Russian game, which has a long history in Ukraine. It is also, for example, the end of an interesting process of attempt of building an industrial society in Ukraine, which is also coming to an end in our eyes. It is also a very interesting point when the eastern expansion of European Union is over, in my opinion. And it is, for me, a very interesting point when a very significant shift took place in Russian society in its perception of whether Russia, not Ukraine, is Europe, and what does it mean. We have a very long story which lasts for 3 centuries, in which Russia performed in the European discourse, in the discourse of Europeans, 2 roles. One was the role of eternal apprentice. Russia was all the time learning and trying to get the approval, trying to get the good mark. And the second role was the role of the barbarian at the gate. We can see how both roles were at a stage after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Interesting that now, recently, the majority of Russian public started to understand the mechanisms. So what you have now is the situation which reminded me of one very interesting episode which happened to me in the Heathrow airport several years ago. I was looking desperately for a room for smokers. And I approached a police officer in Heathrow, and I said, where can I find it? And he said, we don't have one. I said, but every decent European airport has at least a telephone box for smokers. He said, but we are not Europe. And at that moment, I realized that here lies the Russian solution to all the problems in relations with Europe. We are not Europe. we are not your apprentices. The game is over. So here I can pass the right to answer to the question about Ukraine.
Yes, you are not Europe. I accept it, absolutely. I think that's, well, the historical aspects of Russia. Well, it's commonplace that Russian national identity, Russian imperial identity was formed before Russian national identity was formed, and this is one of the historical problems of Russian identity. I also would remind us about Russian idea of special path, or Russian Sonderweg, which is now also one way quite popular, or was quite popular recently. And well, one of the major problems in Ukrainian-Russian relations in terms of history and historical experience is that Russians are not capable of understanding that Ukrainians are others. They believe that Ukrainians are ours, that Ukrainians are a part of great Russian people, that they are Russians with different language probably, but they are the same. And this can be applied to everybody, to elites, to ordinary people. So this is one of the greatest problems in relationship. Ukrainians
help us to explain, where does this come from? Ukrainians are ours. Well, they are not really different. They are little Russians.
Well, I think that Alex is much better a specialist in this case. He wrote a brilliant book in 2000, which was published, well, 16 years ago, and then, by the way, republished in Ukraine in Russian, with amendments. I think that's, well, it starts in the 19th century when Russians started to discuss Ukrainians, and they believed that Ukrainians are Russians, but they are spoiled by Poles. So now
they're spoiled by Poles. By people.
Yes. Now some Russians believe that they are Russians, but they are spoiled by Americans. And they, in the past, they were spoiled by Germans, by Poles, whatever. They always us, but they are spoiled by somebody. Well, of course, I'm doing this. I simplify things to a great extent. So this is the problem. But Ukrainians, it is very important that Ukrainians do believe that Russians are others. And this is the point of misconnection between the two outlooks. So at the same time, there was statistics, real sociology, that at the top peak of the conflict in summer 2014, still majority of Ukrainians were positive about Russians, even in summer 2014. Now, situation is much worse in these terms. The war, well, broke these two people to a certain level of enmity in both countries, by the way. Anti-Russian sentiment is quite strong now in Ukraine. Anti-Ukrainian sentiment is quite strong in Russia. So, and in this case, we really see completely new history. Who decides where Ukraine belongs to? Well, we have sociology. Until 2014, the number of Ukrainians, according to sociological polls, who believed that Ukraine should go to Europe in any form was growing. Unfortunately, I have also to admit the fact that still, until now, the last opinion poll was done in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, 2004, I believe in spring 2014, sorry. And again, majority of population there is still against Euro integration, is for closer ties with Russia.
So Russians are others. So many people in Ukraine would argue. Help us to understand some crucial points that define this complicated relationship?
To begin with, in the 17th century, Muscovites knew that those people who live across the border under the Polish king are very different. Even those people who were Orthodox in their faith were even demanded to take second time baptism if they moved to Moscow. Now then we have the Khmelnytsky uprising, the middle of the 17th century. Khmelnytsky successfully eliminated Poles and Jews from the left bank of Ukraine, of the Dnieper, and came under the protectorate or rule or whatever of the Muscovite Tsar. In the cave monastery, the clergy of this monastery wrote a book which was called Synopsis, and which remained the main book of history for the whole Muscovite state during the 18th century, which was arguing that Little Russia and Great Russia are parts of one single narod, people, folk. So the idea that it is one people comes from Kiev, not from Moscow. Point number two, when we look at fights which happened between Ukrainian nationalists and Russian nationalists in Kiev before the First World War, who are fighting? It is not Russians as what we mean now by this word. These are people who consider themselves to be Malorossi, little Russians, which means for them Russians, because these Russians consist of Great Russians, Little Russians, and White Russians. About being spoiled, let me remind you about the discourse under which United Germany, under the guidance of Bismarck, liberated Alsace. Liberated Alsace. That was the discourse of the time. These people, Alsatian people, who were they? They were Germans, spoiled by the French rule for ages. So they had to be somehow purified to become proper Germans. That is a typical discourse of big imperial nationalisms. Now we go into the period after the First World War, when very important things happen, because part of Ukraine goes under the Polish rule, and part remains in the Soviet Union, where for the first time it becomes quasi-state, Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. I mean, for a long time, because, Georgiy would correct me if I don't do it myself, there were some ephemeridal Ukrainian state formations during the revolution and civil war period. Now, what happens in this Soviet Ukraine? The identification, Little Russian, is simply taken out of usage. There is no such option in the censuses anymore. What you have is the Bolshevik policy of Ukrainization, which was not a concession to the strength of Ukrainian nationalism, but rather an element of fight against the main enemy. The main enemy was the Russian nationalism, because it was Russian nationalism which was driving white movement in the Civil War. Now, in the Soviet Ukraine, people were taught that they are Ukrainians, but nobody was teaching them that Russians are their enemies. And the Ukrainian identity shaped in the Soviet Ukraine in the interwar period did not have Russians as the constitutive other. In Poland, that was different. In Poland, Russians are the main enemy. Well, particularly if you forget about Jews on the ground. So, the Ukrainian nationalism, which was shaped in the western regions of Ukraine, which were under Polish rule in the interwar period, produced this movement, which is one of the key focus points of disagreements, historical disagreements, not only between Russians and Ukrainians, but also among Ukrainians themselves. Bandera, radical Ukrainian nationalism, people who participated in Holocaust, people who participated in Volhynian massacre of Polish population, people who are being glorified by part of political spectrum today in Ukraine. You can see it as a Ukrainian problem, but you can see it as a pan-European problem. Because before the eastern extension of European Union in 2004, memorial culture in Germany here and in all European Union as it was by that time was focused on the problem of responsibility for wrongdoings of one's nation in the 20th century. People who came into European Union at 2004 said, no, we are the victims. Our nation is the victim. Our memorial culture is about our victimhood. And the small issues that these guys who were fighting, indeed, the Soviets, for our independence in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, etc., were also participating in Holocaust. It is not that important. So this is now the European problem. And you are facing it today. And Ukrainians are facing it outside Europe in their own country. And in this respect, Russia is not Europe because it does not have the old European memorial culture of penitence and being focused on responsibility, but it also doesn't have the memorial culture which is focused on her own victimhood. And that is a difference.
Ukrainians as victims, Professor Kasianov, help us out, especially in relation to Stepan Bandera, a radical Ukrainian nationalist fighting for the independence of his country, taking allies like Hitler, living in Munich, in the German city of Munich after World War II, building an émigré network, partly financed, if I recall correctly, by the American Secret Service, CIA, and he was killed by a KGB agent in 1959, and he was living in Munich under the name of Stefan Popel. Okay. So is he a hero of Ukraine or not?
Well, officially, he was awarded by Mr. Yushchenko a title of Hero of Ukraine in 2010 in January.
Who was Ukraine's president?
Yes, Mr. Yushchenko was Ukraine's president this time. Then this decision was dismissed by Donetsk court on the basis that Bandera never been a citizen of Ukraine, which is also true. And only citizen of Ukraine can be awarded this title. Bandera himself never fought. He never took arms, and he just organized. Once he organized, the killing was of co-organizers of killing of Minister of Interior in Poland, and then he successfully split his own organization twice. So I don't think that the person of this caliber can be considered as a hero of Ukraine. But we do not speak about, when Ukrainians discuss Bandera, they do not discuss a real person. They discuss a symbol.
Symbol for what?
Symbol of fight for independence. Symbol, myth. It's not, if we speak about concrete person or personality, you would not be very much attracted by this kind of personality. So if you will ask ordinary people about Bandera, now we have about 40 monuments to Bandera in Western Ukraine. And if you will ask people there in Western Ukraine, staying close to this monument, one of these monuments, who was Bandera, and ask about his biography, whatever, you would have no information almost. They will say just slogans. He fought for Ukraine, he died for Ukraine, he is hero, and this is it. So, and now, unfortunately, now we have a part of political establishment, I don't speak about all political establishment, part of it. People with, radical nationalist views who had the Institute of National Memory, which was established by Yushchenko in 2006, very similar to the same institution in Poland, by the way, in terms of ideology. And it is a kind of, they want to play a role of Ministry of Truth. And they impose certain visions of the past to the society. And society, reacts in very different ways. I would not say that, the whole population of Ukraine is quite enthusiastic about Bandera and about making him a hero of Ukraine, etc., etc. Unfortunately, these people in the Institute of National Memory managed to adopt 4 memorial laws in Ukraine, which two of them were heavily criticized by the Venetian Commission because they limit the freedom of speech very much. And so at least now, when I speak critically, publicly about Bandera, now I am committing it's not a criminal crime, but it is, crime against something. I don't know about what. So, unfortunately, we have this situation now. And I can say that society is not accepting in this case. So we do our best to criticize this institution, to criticize this policy, etc. And, we always have this kind of race of this kind of people after revolutions. The same was after 2004. Now we have the same after 2014. And these people, left after 2006 or 2007, and I'm sure that they will leave the political stage later. So, for me personally, as a citizen of Ukraine, Bandera is not hero, and Ukrainian radical nationalists and their ideology is not mine, and the same can be applied to majority of population of Ukraine. Yes, it is. I'm sorry. Yes, it is popular among certain segments, but if we'll speak about political influence, look at the elections of 2014. Look at the elections, presidential and elections to the parliaments. Radical nationalists lost these elections. The presidential candidate from radical right won less than 1% of votes, And the same, well, applies to political parties. Svoboda, a right-wing political party, did not reach the parliament this time in 2014.
The German press was very heavily criticized while reporting from Ukraine after the events on the Maidan, and it was heavily criticized for especially one thing, that we as German media were not reporting accurately enough about the right radical nationalist danger appearing and growing.
Well, I see that Alex is, well, I can give him my time to criticize me, so please.
So you want to criticize?
First of all, this argument that Bandera is a symbol which is not related to the real Bandera. Guys, Stalin is a symbol for Stalinists. They don't know who Stalin really is. It is the same. It is the same. Just imagine that you have 40 monuments of Stalin created in Russia today. What would you have done to Mr. Putin? Now, coming to serious things. It is not that history determines political development very much, but memory politics are very important for the development of the processes. Let me call your attention to the role which Bandera, as a symbol, played in the development of what Georgiy refers to as the revolution. To begin with, all the time, through all the period of Maidan, the biggest portrait which was there, one and single, it was the portrait of Bandera. Second, the crucial moment when, in my opinion, the movement was defeated, self-defeated, was January the 1st, 2014. What happened? You remember there were three parties. Yatsenyuk, Klitschko, and Tyagnybok of Svoboda Party. Now, Tyagnybok proclaimed that he is going to organize a Fakkelzug in Kiev on the 1st of January to commemorate the birthday of Bandera. Klitschko and Yatsenyuk were telling him, don't do it, you discredit the movement. He explained them where they should go, and they went in this direction, and he organized this Fakkelzug, which was joined by more than 10,000 people. It was a huge success. After that, the three slogans of the Bandera movement became obligatory for those who spoke from the scene of Maidan. Slava Ukraini, Geroyam Slava. Glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. If you wouldn't pronounce this slogan at the beginning of your speech at least 3 times, people would not simply allow you to talk. What happened? A liberal element of the Maidan movement lost their symbolic battle. And today, these crowds of paramilitary, think about this word and what particular sort of political structures are being represented by such things. Go around Kiev shouting, Slava Ukraini, Geroyam Slava. I think that in symbolic terms, the liberal part of Maidan lost on January 1st, 2014.
I mean, if we look into the European Union, to countries of the European Union, I mean, there's lots to criticize as well when it comes to populism and the rise of nationalism, as we've seen in recent times, and probably also in Germany itself. This brings me to Twitter and reactions, questions.
I would only have two questions at the moment, but I just wanted to point out that we're 90 minutes into the discussion, which means that we should also open for questions from the audience here, and then we need to wrap up because I'm certain that everybody's waiting for their glass of wine, which is waiting outside. Now, two questions which I would just like to relate from Twitter. The first is, I believe, fairly general, but all the more intriguing. What is history, narration of the past, or ideology of a nation? I believe that we've touched on that point intermittently during the evening, but to boil it down to exactly that question, is it actually still a narration of the past, or is it purely and merely ideology of a nation? What is history? And then one question which I believe also moves the audience is, whose is the Crimea, to put it that bluntly?
Good question.
Now, I would say our tradition here is for, after the second Twitter questions being brought in, to open directly for questions from the audience here. And my colleague here also has a microphone, and she will be glad to take your question in front there. Please do feel free to pose your question in German as well. We'll translate that into English.
Okay, there's one question here in front. The gentleman in the first row.
You might have one. I assume you don't need it.
Wenn wir die erste Frage nach der Verfasstheit der ukrainischen Nation betrachten, muss man sie ja in Symbiose und Differenz zu der russischen sehen, was ich durchaus vergleichen möchte mit Deutschland und der Deutschschweiz oder den Niederlanden. Und wenn die Ukraine als Staat erfolgreich überhaupt in der Zukunft bestehen möchte, besteht nur die Möglichkeit einer Föderalisierung. Aber nicht im Sinne der Föderation, wie wir sie in Belgien haben, sondern wahrscheinlich eher wie in der Bundesrepublik Deutschland, da Belgien nun auch ein zerfallender Staat ist. Vielen Dank.
Also Föderalisierung, ja oder nein? Das haben wir notiert. Ich würde gerne noch zwei Fragen sammeln, und dann machen wir in einem Rutsch auch die Antwort auf die sehr leichte Frage, wem gehört die Krim? Ja, bitte.
Meine Frage bezieht sich auch auf die Krim. Es ist eine historische Frage. Wir hören immer davon, dass sie von Nikita Khrushchev von der Russischen Sowjetischen Republik zur Ukrainischen Republik zugeschlagen wurde, ohne dass es dafür richtige Erklärungen gibt, warum das eigentlich damals passiert ist. Darüber gibt es viele Legenden. Was wäre Ihre Einschätzung dazu?
Ja. Noch eine Frage aus dem Publikum soweit? Guten Abend.
I would say that Russia, with all its history, is a European country. And the United States have developed out of the history of Europe. And then we have another third Europe, the European countries, the European Union, which try to unite. I would say, as long as there is the endeavor to rule, Obama last year claimed we want leadership. As long as there is this endeavor, as long as there will be no peace. The answer must be partnership.
Partnership. I noted that, and we start with the question of Crimea. Who does Crimea belong to? The Pearl of the Empire. Mr. Kasianov.
Crimea belongs to God. So, as we are, so in political terms, in terms of international law, Crimea belongs to Ukraine, and this fact was the current frontiers, current borders were recognized by all parties, including Russia. So if we will go into more details in terms of cultural belongings, historical belonging, etc., I think that Crimea also belongs to Crimean Tatars, as is their homeland. So I think that's why I believe that Greeks would not claim Crimea because they colonized it before Christ. Historical arguments in this case can be played by many sides. However, I think that we have to, well, in these problems, we have to follow international law. According to international law, Crimea belongs to Ukraine. Did Ukraine fail in making Crimea an integral part of Ukrainian culture? Yes, Ukrainian governments failed to do this. 5 years ago, there were 6 Ukrainian schools in Crimea located in former kindergartens, which is a shame because 25% of population of Crimea in 2001, according to census 2001, called themselves Ukrainians. So, unfortunately, I have to admit that Ukrainian governments did nothing to make Crimea an integral part of Ukraine, to introduce Ukrainian culture to population, to extend the network of Ukrainian schools, etc., etc. So, but of course, this fact does not justify any kind of annexation. So, my final point, politically, in the terms of international law, yes, of course, it's part of Ukraine.
Why was Crimea given?
Sorry.
No. This is what I wanted to ask Alexey, by General Secretary Khrushchev to Ukraine.
I don't know.
You have a guess, an educated one.
Well, first of all, we have to remember that giving Crimea from the Russian Federative Socialist Republic to Ukrainian Federative Socialist Republic, which were the parts of the Soviet Union, did not mean giving it from one sovereign country to another sovereign country. Ukraine had it for 25 years, and it did 2 things to lose it, both very effectively. Number one, exactly what Georgiy claims to be the thing which Ukraine didn't do enough. The solution from Ukrainian perspective was to build more Ukrainian schools and to make people more comfortable with the small Ukrainian schools in Crimea, which is generally Russian-speaking. It's not a very promising strategy. Second, it was very clear from the very beginning, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that Crimea is an issue. There is a Russian naval base and many other things and so on. It was very clear that Crimea remains Ukrainian until Ukraine doesn't sail too far from Russia. As soon as it does, things start to happen, and things started to happen. Here comes yet another question. We are talking about international law, and according to international law, Ukraine can claim Crimea, but it will not help you much. The problem is that we have also to include the issue of the referendum, whether you like it or not, because you can address the issue, how you can get out of this impasse. Organize a new referendum. The outcome is clear. Under the control of the OSCE,
OSCE.
Yeah, OSCE. So my point is that certain things are not known. I have in this story one question. I don't have answer to this question. It is very clear that the operation of taking control over Crimea was prepared in Moscow for quite a while. It was there. It was like one of the possible scenarios. When this control was taken, the referendum was announced. It had to take place in May, and the question was whether Crimea wants to get a broader autonomous status in Ukraine or become independent. There was no question about joining Russia. Then, 2 times, within 1 week, the formulation of the question was changed and the date of the referendum was moved. So, the first design of the questions was what was prepared. I don't have an answer to my question, which interests me a lot. What Putin was learning during this week when he was reformulating the questions and moving the date of referendum? For me, it's a very interesting question. I would give up to 100 euros to get an answer to this question, or even more.
101.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that is the point. There are many issues of economic nature, infrastructure nature. Crimea was getting water from Ukraine,
Yes.
Electricity from Ukraine. There was no need to build communication because it was seen as part of one country. We could see how Ukraine was cutting supplies of water, of electricity, of food to Crimea. Even without this infrastructure, Crimea can survive. So when this infrastructure will be in place, it will survive even more confidently. So that was a political thing.
Apparently in Russia there's not a real question of kind of giving Crimea back to Ukraine, and if you talk to Western politicians when it comes to kind of settlement Ukraine and Russia, maybe in the Minsk agreement format, when it comes to realpolitik, my guess would be that Crimea would be taken back for the very, very long run. We are running a little late here, so the question of federalization is a very important one when it comes to the development in Ukraine and also into maybe solving the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Federalization, Mr. Kasianov, is this political concept really on the agenda of the Ukrainian government, or do they have other things to do right now? Changing prime ministers?
I don't think that
so
the issue of federalization is the top priority for Ukraine, for any Ukrainian government which will be settled in Kiev. So the very term federalization is quite discredited in Ukrainian political language. So if you say federalization, you mean separatism.
You mean separatism?
Separatism, yes. The problem is that, well, in the beginning of the 90s, when Ukraine became independent, there were federalist projects in Ukraine. They were not very much successful, and Ukraine remained a unitary country, and all local elites who fought for power, and all local elites came from the regions, not from Kiev. They all fought for Kiev and for centralized government, for centralized financial streams, for centralized politics in the field of economics, for centralized corruption and whatever. So in this case, federalization, the major problem also is that if you will ask any top political statement, will ask him what federalization is, and then you will have no clear answer. The issue itself is not developed among political elites. They prefer now speak about decentralization, about commuting more rights to the regions, and in fact this process is on. And now Ukraine is redrafting itself in terms of so-called territorial communities. So old administrative division is, well, just at certain regions now is out, and local communities are being organized with very different waves of self-organization and financing, etc., etc. So this process will take no less than, well, several years. The administrative reform and decentralization. The word federalization is out of political vocabulary now.
We want to end on an optimistic note, picking up on partnership, and whether you see a chance, and this would be my last question to both of you, whether you see a chance that Ukraine and Russia, with their common complex history, living together, whether you would see a reasonable chance that they will live as peaceful neighbors in a, let's put it that way, greater Europe of any kind in the foreseeable future, meaning before we reach our pension age?
Well, I think that greater Europe is over. We should forget about it, and nobody takes it seriously. But there is a chance. And this chance comes from China. For a very simple reason. Because what we have now, all this mess, all this shit, all this blood, it is a common achievement of European politicians, Muscovite politicians, and Ukrainian politicians, and American politicians. Now, why China? Because China had found itself surrounded by countries which are partly afraid of her, partly hostile to China, and the only really friendly neighbor, surprise, surprise, is Russia. And the funny thing is that it plays into big Chinese project of Silk Road, which is supposed to extend a common economic space into Europe, through Russia, through Ukraine, which is rather a playground than a nectar. But if you have the agenda which is driven by economic interest, European politicians and Muscovite politicians failed to, through all these 3 years, to come to a very simple understanding that any stabilization of Ukraine before the crisis and after the crisis, particularly, should have been based on the idea of common effort from Moscow, from European Union. I'm not speaking about Brussels anymore, but maybe Berlin. Well, we have forget about Warsaw now. Now, they failed. They failed. I remember how I was discussing in April 2014. I was asking, can you stabilize Ukraine without cooperation of Putin? The answer was always no. So why are you saying that Putin shouldn't have a say in Ukraine? You have already told him that in 2013. He was asking, let us talk before the association agreement.
Okay, Mr.
He was
Kasianov.
said, it is not your business. He explained in pretty drastic terms, in bloody terms, and that is his fault, that it is his business, and he can explain everybody that he has his business here. Hopefully, with the help of the Chinese, this lesson can be learned, and we can come to a positive agenda of common economic processes in this space. But for this, we need Chinese.
Okay,
Europeans
that's
failed.
quite a long way along the Silk Road to the Chinese, but where do you see the starting point for peaceful neighborhood?
Well, if Russia will become a part of Greater China, there is a chance that we will have a real good neighborhood. Alex just mentioned that European and American leaders didn't speak to Putin, and this is why the problem arose. Now they do speak to Putin, and problem is not solved. So the problem is that the things went too far at this moment, and I myself do not have any recipe to deal with this dish, and I don't know how to consume it. So I think that's in a longer perspective, of course, I myself would be very happy if Ukraine and Russia would be good neighbors in the future. It is obvious you have two countries with the longest borderline between them, and of course they have to live in peace and in cooperation. Unfortunately, at this very moment, I don't see real prospects for solution of this problem, particularly when Russia has military specialists and troops in Donbass, when there is no border between Donbass part of Ukraine and Russia, and where there is always possibility that whatever can be brought to these territories and whoever can be brought there, and by just one telephone call, everything will be turned into open war. So, and this is the greatest problem. And I also don't believe that if it will be closed border and that Russian troops will be withdrawn from the Donbass, and then there will be OECD or whatever mission there, which just looking for the order, whatever. The problem is that now we have a kind of changes of attitudes in Russia and in Ukraine towards people and between peoples. And if you look through Levada Center opinion polls, you see that that number of Russians who have negative attitude towards Ukrainian is growing, and the same is in Ukraine. So it will take years and probably decades to normalize relationship between people. I would say that if we will, to go to, you asked for optimistic note, I have a lot of colleagues in Russia, including Alexey Miller, who we can disagree, we can fight in words, but we keep good relations, professional and personal. So I think it might be a model that at least people from both sides, intellectuals, culture activists, whoever who can speak who can speak normally about very complicated problems, that this is a chance to keep a kind of normal dialogue between us and between these two countries.
Could there be, ladies and gentlemen, a better final word, a better Schlusswort than people talking to each other, trying to understand each other, whether it's in Hamburg or wherever you both meet again? Apparently you are good neighbors in your fields, and that's at least the little optimistic note I wanted to end on. Thank you so much for your patience, for listening, diving into the complicated, partly uncharted territory of Ukrainian, Russian, European history. This is only the beginning. So there will be more, and hopefully we'll see you here again next time. Thank you so much, and now enjoy the wine. Thank you.